There comes a moment when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop chasing clarity from someone who has no intention of offering it, when you stop trying to prove your worth to a person who already knows your value. They just don't know how to handle it. And that moment, that silence, is the exact moment an avoidant begins to feel what they spent the entire relationship running from. Your silence isn't punishment. It's not manipulation. It's not a strategy. It's a natural response when love has been replaced with exhaustion. Because you can only repeat yourself so many times. You can only reassure someone who is afraid of closeness for so long. Eventually, you run out of words. And when the words stop, the avoidant suddenly loses the shield they've been hiding behind. See, avoidants don't run because you said too much. They run because your presence forced them to face themselves. When you were speaking, explaining, reaching, trying, they could tell themselves a story. She's too much. He's overwhelming. I need space. But when you go quiet, suddenly they have to sit with a truth that terrifies them. It was never your words. It was the intimacy behind them. Silence removes the noise. It removes the narrative they created about you. It removes the excuse. And without excuses, they're left with themselves, their patterns, their fears, their avoidance. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects the consequences of distancing themselves from someone who genuinely cared. They expected your silence to make life easier. Instead, it creates pressure. Because silence from someone who loved them doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like loss. It feels like reality. It feels like the moment they realize, oh, they're not chasing me anymore, and that thought triggers the avoidant more deeply than any conversation ever could. Because for the first time, they don't feel in control. For the first time, they sense you're no longer held in their orbit. For the first time, they feel the weight of what they pushed away. Silence becomes the moment they recognize value. It becomes the moment regret begins. It becomes the moment they understand that you weren't asking for too much. You were offering more than they knew how to receive. Your silence isn't loud because it's empty. It's loud because it's final. It's the point where your self-respect speaks louder than your longing ever did. And the avoidant, they hear it. Oh, they hear it clearly. They hear it in every space where your energy used to be. They hear it in the peace you no longer beg for. They hear it in the distance you no longer try to close. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of self-worth. And that triggers them more than any words ever could. When you stop talking, when you stop explaining yourself, when you finally let go of the need to justify your feelings, something shifts in the dynamic with an avoidant. Silence is not emptiness. It is a powerful presence that forces them to confront the reality they've been avoiding. For so long, an avoidant relies on your words, your reassurances, and your explanations to create a story that keeps them comfortable. They tell themselves they're too emotional, or they're overthinking, or they're asking for too much. These words act as a shield, a protective mechanism that allows them to stay distant without truly facing the impact of their behavior. But the moment you stop talking, that shield starts to crack. Your silence removes the narrative they've built around you. Suddenly, there is no explanation to twist, no reassurance to dismiss, no words to redirect their attention away from themselves. They are left staring at the raw truth. Your patience is not infinite, your energy is not unlimited, and your love is not conditional upon their avoidance. This is terrifying for someone who has built their identity around evasion because it forces them to reckon with something they have spent the relationship running from, the consequences of their emotional distance. Silence acts like a mirror, reflecting their choices without judgment, without commentary, and without the distraction of your attempts to fix or clarify. It exposes what they may not have wanted to see. That their distance, their withdrawal, and their refusal to engage fully has real emotional weight, that it affects someone who truly cared. Unlike words, which can be argued against, minimized, or redirected, silence cannot be negotiated. Silence cannot be blamed on tone, context, or misunderstanding. It simply exists, and in its existence, it communicates a truth that cannot be avoided. An avoidant may initially try to fill the silence, attempt to break it with excuses or deflection, but the power of your absence is steady and undeniable. They begin to feel the discomfort they have meticulously sidestepped, and it triggers a subtle panic, a realization that their avoidance is no longer met with tolerance, that their pattern is now fully visible, and that the person they relied on to cushion their fears has chosen to step back. This is the moment when silence becomes louder than any argument or explanation ever could, because it removes the safety nets they relied upon. It forces them to confront themselves, their choices, and the reality of what they have been creating in the relationship. And in that confrontation, they feel something unfamiliar and unsettling. The absence of control over someone who once bent to their emotional distance. The undeniable presence of a person who values themselves enough to step away from endless explanations. And the beginning of a realization that maybe they cannot avoid the truth forever. Avoidants thrive on control, especially when it comes to emotional distance. They are masters at keeping others at arm's length while maintaining the illusion that they are untouchable, independent, and self-sufficient. For them, relationships are a delicate balancing act where they can regulate how much closeness they allow and how much vulnerability they are willing to tolerate. The moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop trying to bridge the gap, everything they believed about the dynamic begins to shift. Suddenly, the invisible strings they thought they were holding are no longer in their hands. When you withdraw, when you create space without drama or pleading, you remove the familiar rhythm that allowed them to feel in control. Your silence is not empty, it's disruptive. It forces them into a state they are uncomfortable with, uncertainty. Avoidants are used to being the ones who decide when, how, and if emotional closeness happens. They have built patterns over years, sometimes decades, to protect themselves from intimacy. When you stop negotiating for their attention, when you stop providing explanations, when you stop giving them the chance to run the show emotionally, you are challenging the foundation of their coping mechanism. They are confronted with a reality they rarely experience. Someone who is fully present with their own boundaries, someone who does not bend to their avoidance, someone who does not allow their fear of closeness to dictate the pace of the relationship. This loss of control can be alarming because avoidants are not used to being in situations where their emotional comfort is not the priority. They may initially respond with confusion, frustration, or attempts to regain influence because their instinct is to restore the previous balance. But no amount of avoidance or deflection can fill the space you've consciously created. And in that space, they are forced to recognize the consequences of their avoidance. The dynamic they relied on for safety is disrupted. They begin to feel what it means when someone stops adjusting to their fears, stops accommodating their distance, and stops trying to explain why they feel disconnected. Your silence, your absence of reaction, your refusal to engage on their terms communicates more than words ever could. It signals independence, self-respect, and boundaries. And this is profoundly triggering for the avoidant, because for the first time, they are no longer the ones dictating the pace of the relationship. Your silence challenges the control they thought they had and makes them realize that intimacy cannot be evaded forever, that patterns have consequences, and that someone they once assumed would always bend to their avoidance is capable of stepping away. This shift disrupts their sense of comfort, forces reflection, and ignites the very awareness that leads them to question their choices and eventually reconsider what they have lost. Your silence has a way of revealing truths that words never could. When you step back and stop explaining, stop pleading, stop justifying, you give the avoidant no distractions, no scripts, no safety nets. They are forced to confront the reality they've been avoiding, and that confrontation is uncomfortable because it is unavoidable. Throughout the relationship, they have relied on your energy, your explanations, and your attempts to clarify misunderstandings as a buffer against facing their own patterns. Every word you spoke could be minimized, rationalized, or ignored. Every message you sent, every question you asked, every concern you raised could be spun into a story that justified their distance. She's overthinking, he's too demanding, I just need space. But silence changes the rules. Silence does not need to be interpreted or debated. It simply exists. And in that existence, it forces them to face consequences they have spent so long deflecting. When you stop chasing, stop reaching, and stop trying to fill the emotional gaps, the avoidant begins to see the impact of their avoidance in the most undeniable way. Absence. Absence is unarguable. absence cannot be twisted into a narrative of misunderstanding. It simply reflects the truth. Their withdrawal matters. It has cost them the connection they once had, and it has left a space that can only be filled by reflection, not words. In that silence, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of what they created, the gaps they left unbridged, the emotional distance they enforced, the moments of connection they rejected. The silence becomes a mirror that reflects the reality of the relationship without judgment, without manipulation, and without pleading. It exposes the consequences of their choices in a way that no argument or explanation ever could. They may initially try to fill the silence with excuses, distractions, or even attempts to reestablish control, but the power of your quiet presence, or absence of presence, is steady. It forces them to reckon with themselves and the effects of their avoidance. This moment is unsettling because it removes all the familiar crutches they leaned on, your patience, your energy, your willingness to explain. There is nothing left for them to manipulate or reinterpret. They are left with clarity, raw and undeniable. The silence shows them what they have taken for granted, what they have pushed away, and what they may never be able to recover. In that quiet, they feel the emotional gap they created, and it resonates more profoundly than any conversation or confrontation ever could. It is here, in the space of non-communication, that they begin to understand the real consequences of avoidance, and it triggers an awareness of what they have lost in a way that words, no matter how heartfelt, could never achieve. When you step back and allow silence to take its place, something unexpected happens. Your value becomes undeniable. For someone with avoidant tendencies, value has always been a concept that exists only when it is convenient to acknowledge. They often take for granted the patience, care, and emotional energy you pour into the relationship because it has been consistently available, even when they themselves are distant or disengaged. Your presence, your attention, and your willingness to understand them become background noise in their life, a resource they assume will always be there no matter how much they push it away. But when you withdraw, when you stop explaining, stop chasing, and stop justifying, the avoidant is forced to notice what they once ignored. The absence of your energy and the lack of your constant reassurance suddenly highlights the depth of what they have been missing. This is the moment your value shines the brightest. Not because you are saying it, not because you are proving it, but because it exists independently of their acknowledgement. Avoidants are rarely confronted with the consequences of underestimating someone who truly cares. They are used to creating distance and having it tolerated, to acting emotionally unavailable and being met with understanding. Your silence disrupts this dynamic. It forces them to recognize that the support, the affection, and the emotional labor they once received effortlessly is no longer being offered on demand. Every interaction they once took for granted now feels absent, and absence communicates more than words ever could. In that space, they start to grasp the full extent of your worth, the patience that allowed them room to retreat, the compassion that covered their avoidance, the understanding that accepted their flaws without judgment. They realize that what they dismissed as oversensitivity or overreaction was actually strength, presence, and unwavering care. The reality that they can no longer take you for granted triggers a sense of discomfort, because the avoidant thrives in environments where they are in control and the consequences of their distance are obscured. Your withdrawal removes that comfort and forces them to confront their underestimation of your value. It's a subtle, yet powerful awakening. They feel the weight of what they have lost without needing a confrontation, without needing explanations, without needing you to argue your worth. Silence does not boast, it simply allows the truth of your presence and the vacuum of your absence to speak for itself. It signals that you are no longer a resource to be managed, controlled, or assumed. It signals that your worth exists independently of their acknowledgement. And for an avoidant, that recognition is both unsettling and illuminating, because for the first time, they are made to understand that the person they undervalued has always had value, and that value was never contingent on their behavior. Your silence communicates something that words never could: independence. It signals that you are no longer bound to the chaos of someone else's avoidance. that your peace matters more than their fear of intimacy, and that your life can move forward without needing their validation. Avoidants are often triggered not by conflict, not by anger, and not by criticism, but by the realization that they no longer hold power over someone they once assumed would always bend to their emotional distance. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop trying to manage their feelings, you demonstrate that your emotional well-being is not contingent upon their approval or presence. This is profoundly unsettling for someone who has grown accustomed to running from intimacy while expecting the other person to adapt. Silence in this context is not passive, it is an active declaration of self-respect. It says, I will no longer rearrange my life to fit the patterns of your avoidance. I will no longer dilute my energy to accommodate your fears. I will no longer chase what does not wish to be caught. For the avoidant, who has spent the relationship comfortably in control of distance, this shift creates a subtle yet undeniable pressure. They can no longer assume that you will remain available on their terms. They can no longer rely on their usual defenses, withdrawal, coldness, deflection. Instead, they are confronted with the reality that you exist outside their orbit of influence, that your choices are guided by your own self-respect rather than their fear of closeness. This realization can be startling because it exposes the imbalance they created and forces them to acknowledge their own behavior. Silence, in this sense, becomes more than the absence of words. It becomes a demonstration of emotional autonomy. You are not asking them to change, you are not pleading for recognition, and you are not making ultimatums. You are simply living fully within the boundaries of your own worth. And that truth, quiet yet unmistakable, resonates in a way that words, arguments, or explanations never could. Avoidants are wired to respond to control dynamics, and when they sense that they no longer control your attention, your energy, or your emotional state, it creates an internal shift. They may feel discomfort, confusion, even a longing they are reluctant to admit. But more importantly, they begin to recognize that your independence is not temporary, that your peace is not negotiable, and that your absence is not a threat, but a natural consequence of your self-respect. Over time, silence signals that you are not only capable of existing without them, you are thriving without needing them to validate your worth. And this is profoundly triggering for someone who has relied on avoidance as a way to maintain emotional safety. The realization that you are no longer dependent on their approval, that your life does not revolve around managing their fear, and that your boundaries are firm, forces them to reconsider not only their behavior, but also the value of the person they have been taking for granted. In this way, silence becomes the most powerful statement of all. It is independence made visible, self-worth made undeniable, and emotional boundaries made real. In the end, your silence is not emptiness. It is a statement of self-respect, a reflection of your worth, and a mirror that shows an avoidant the consequences of their distance. It communicates more than words ever could, revealing value, independence, and the emotional truth they can no longer ignore. By stepping back, you reclaim your power, honor your peace, and allow them to face the reality they have been avoiding. Thank you all for listening and for allowing yourselves to recognize the strength in choosing presence, boundaries, and self-respect over endless explanations and unreciprocated chasing.